In the shimmering neon of 1960s Las Vegas, Elvis Presley finally met his match. Not in the woman waiting at home, but in his fiery co-star, Ann-Margret. Their chemistry was electric, a collision of two superstars destined for forever. Yet, in a cold, calculated move that would haunt them both, the king suddenly went silent. No calls, no goodbye. Just a guitar-shaped wreath and a lifetime of what-ifs that ended in a lonely Memphis funeral. To understand why Elvis Presley walked away from the woman many believe was the true love of his life, we have to travel back to 1963, to the sweltering, high-energy set of Viva Las Vegas. This wasn't just another movie contract for the king. It was a collision of two celestial bodies. When Ann-Margret walked into his life, she wasn't just a leading lady. She was his mirror image, vibrant, talented, and possessed by the same rhythmic soul that had electrified the world. For the first time, Elvis had met a woman who didn't just admire his light, but burned just as brightly. Their connection was instantaneous and undeniable, a storming love that bypassed the usual Hollywood artifice. On set, the crew watched in awe as the two danced and joked, their chemistry so potent it felt like the film was merely a backdrop for a real-life fairy tale. They shared a sense of humor, a love for music, and a deep, underlying loneliness that only those at the pinnacle of fame can truly understand. In Ann-Margret, Elvis found a peer, someone who understood the weight of the crown he wore and the pressure of the spotlight. But while this fire burned in Nevada, a very different reality was waiting behind the iron gates of Graceland. Priscilla Beaulieu, the young woman Elvis had brought over from Germany, represented a different world entirely. She was the old-fashioned ideal that had been etched into Elvis's mind by his Southern upbringing and the conservative expectations of the era. Elvis was a man of profound contradictions. He craved the excitement of a modern, independent woman like Ann-Margret, yet his soul demanded the stability of a traditional housewife who would be waiting for him by the fire. This internal tug-of-war created a fracture in his psyche that would define his relationships for years to come. He was caught between two archetypes, the partner who could challenge him and the partner who would submit to his world. Ann-Margret was a rising star with her own ambitions and a career that was just beginning to skyrocket. To Elvis, a woman with a career was a threat to the domestic peace he thought he needed. He wanted a sanctuary, not a competition, and the more he fell for Ann, the more he realized she could never be the quiet shadow he expected a wife to be. As the filming of Viva Las Vegas drew to a close, the bubble they had inhabited began to show its first cracks. The world was watching, and the rumors were swirling, reaching all the way to a heartbroken Priscilla in Memphis. Elvis was playing a dangerous game, trying to keep two lives separate, but the clock was ticking. He was about to realize that you cannot hold on to a storm and a sanctuary at the same time without something, or someone, breaking. The tension was reaching a boiling point, and the press was hungry for a scandal. While Elvis tried to maintain his composure, the narrative was slipping out of his control. He was standing at a crossroads, forced to choose between the electric future he saw in Ann-Margret's eyes and the safe, familiar promise he had made to a girl in Germany. Little did he know, a single trip to London was about to force his hand and change the course of his life forever. The catalyst for the collapse didn't happen in Hollywood or Memphis, but across the Atlantic. In 1964, Ann-Margret traveled to England for the grand premiere of Viva Las Vegas. The British press, legendary for their tenacity, didn't care about her acting technique or the choreography of the film. They wanted to know about the king. They cornered her with questions about their off-screen chemistry, and Ann-Margret, being the straightforward and honest woman she was, refused to play the coy games expected of starlets at the time. She didn't deny the spark. She didn't hide the affection. To Ann, she was simply being real. But in the mid-60s, real was dangerous. The headlines that hit the newsstands the next morning were explosive. They didn't just hint at a fling, They screamed of an imminent engagement and a looming royal wedding of rock and roll. The articles painted a picture of a couple ready to settle down, effectively casting Ann-Margret as the future Queen of Graceland. It was the kind of publicity that could make a career, but for Elvis, it was a siren that signaled a total loss of control over his carefully curated private life. Panic set in immediately. Ann-Margret, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, desperately called Elvis to explain that her words had been twisted and blown out of proportion. She told him she had been misquoted, that the predatory UK tabloids had manufactured a narrative for the sake of a headline. She was a young woman in love, trying to navigate the shark-infested waters of international fame, but the damage was already done. The woman who was too honest for her own good had accidentally lit a match in a room full of gasoline. Elvis sat in the silence of his room, the phone in his hand feeling heavier than ever. He was caught in a whirlwind of confusion. On one hand, he knew the media's power to distort the truth, but on the other, he felt exposed. The privacy he guarded so fiercely had been stripped away by the very woman he was falling for. He had always kept his worlds in separate boxes, but now the walls were crumbling, and the fallout was already reaching the one place he considered his fortress. While Elvis processed the chaos from London, a far more intimate and volatile storm was brewing within the walls of Graceland. The headlines hadn't just reached the fans. They had landed on the breakfast table of a young, isolated woman who had been promised a very different future. The peace Elvis had sought to maintain was about to be shattered by a confrontation that would push him to his absolute breaking point. Back in Memphis, Priscilla Beaulieu was no longer the quiet teenager waiting patiently for her soldier to return. She was a woman who had moved across the world based on a promise, only to see that promise mocked in international newspapers. When the reports of Elvis and Ann-Margret's engagement reached her, the domestic facade of Graceland exploded. The fights that followed were legendary in their intensity, shouting matches that echoed through the hallways, fueled by years of repressed loneliness and the sudden sharp sting of public humiliation. Elvis, cornered and frustrated, reacted with the volatility of a man who hated being told what to do. On several occasions, as the arguments reached a fever pitch, he threatened to pack Priscilla's bags and send her back to Germany immediately. It was a power play, a way to reassert the dominance he felt slipping away in his professional life. He was the king in the studio and on the stage, and he refused to be questioned within his own home, even if his own actions were the source of the agony. The situation spiraled further when Priscilla's parents, the Beaulieus, were pulled into the fray. They had entrusted their daughter to Elvis under strict conditions, and seeing her name dragged through a public love triangle was more than they could tolerate. The pressure on Elvis wasn't just coming from a jealous partner. It was coming from a family demanding he honor the traditional values he claimed to uphold. He was being forced to face the reality that his old-fashioned ideal came with very real, very modern consequences. In a moment of cold, brutal honesty that would define their relationship, Elvis reportedly looked at a weeping Priscilla and issued a chilling ultimatum. He didn't offer an apology or a romantic reassurance. Instead, he demanded total compliance. He told her he needed a woman who understood that things like this might happen, that his life was too big for standard rules. He asked her, point blank, if she was going to be that woman or not. It wasn't a question of love, it was a demand for endurance. For a time, Priscilla tried to swallow her pride and be that silent, understanding shadow. She attempted to fit the mold he had carved for her, hoping that if she was perfect enough, the ghost of Ann-Margret would finally fade away. But the atmosphere at Graceland had turned toxic, a gilded cage where the resentment was growing thicker by the day. Priscilla was becoming increasingly unhappy, realizing that being the king's choice meant losing her own identity in the process. The tension had reached an unsustainable level, and the people around Elvis knew he couldn't stay in this limbo forever. The storming love with Ann-Margret was a dream, but the reality of his promises to the Beaulieus was a debt that was coming due. As the walls closed in, Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, decided it was time to step in and end the fantasy once and for all, and his intervention would be swift, cold, and final. Colonel Tom Parker never let sentiment interfere with a balance sheet. To him, Elvis Presley was not just a human being, he was a national asset that required strict, calculated management. The affair with Ann-Margret, as dazzling as it was, represented a dangerous distraction from the brand Parker had spent years building. Ann was too bright, too independent, and too much of a star in her own right. She didn't fit the mold of the compliant, ideal wife that Parker envisioned for the king's public image. He needed a domestic narrative to sell to Middle America, and that narrative required a woman who would stand in the shadow, not share the spotlight. The pressure from the colonel began to tighten like a vice. He constantly reminded Elvis of the legal and moral obligations he had to the Beaulieu family, weaponizing Elvis's own Southern sense of honor against him. The Memphis Mafia, Elvis's inner circle, was also caught in the crossfire, torn between wanting their friend to be happy and wanting to protect the stability of the Presley empire. Elvis found himself under siege within his own inner sanctum, realizing that every romantic impulse was being weighed against the cold, hard logic of a man who viewed love as nothing more than a variable in a business equation. In the quiet moments away from the noise, Elvis had to confront a devastating reality. He knew that if he chose Ann-Margret, he would eventually have to ask her to dim her own light. His traditional upbringing and the era's expectations demanded a wife who stayed at home, but he knew he had no right to demand that sacrifice from an artist as gifted as she was. He loved her because she was his equal, yet it was that very equality that made a traditional life together impossible. The realization was a slow, agonizing heartbreak. To keep her meant to change her, and to love her meant he had to let her go. The silence that followed was brutal and absolute. Without a single word of explanation or a final phone call, Elvis abruptly cut off all contact with Ann-Margret. It wasn't the act of a man who had stopped caring, but the desperate retreat of a man who couldn't bear to face the choice he had made. He chose to hide behind his obligations, leaving Ann-Margret in a void of confusion and unanswered questions. This wall of silence, however, was merely the prelude to a final symbolic gesture that would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. On May 1st, 1967, the world watched as Elvis Presley and Priscilla Beaulieu were married in a swift televised ceremony in Las Vegas. It was a massive PR victory for Colonel Parker, a moment of scripted perfection designed to satisfy the fans and the families involved. But those close to Elvis noticed a certain hollowness in his eyes. He was playing the role of the happy groom in a production he no longer believed in. Just 1 week after the I-do's were exchanged, Elvis made a move that revealed exactly where his thoughts were actually drifting. He sent a massive, ornate flower arrangement to Ann-Margret, shaped uniquely like a guitar. The arrangement was far more than a simple gift. It was a floral headstone for the storming love they had shared. By choosing the shape of a guitar, Elvis was sending a coded message that their connection belonged to the world of music, art, and the electric magic of the movie set, a world he was now leaving behind for the sake of a quiet, conventional life. It was a goodbye that was as grand as it was cold, marking the definitive end of their romantic dream and the beginning of a reality he had accepted under duress. When Ann-Margret received the flowers, she finally understood the depth of the silence that had preceded them. She had spent months trying to reach him, sending telegrams and making calls that went unreturned, only to have the answer arrive in the form of a wreath. The sting of being replaced was sharp, but the realization that he had chosen the safe path was even more painful. She saw that the man she considered her soulmate had retreated into his fortress, choosing the sanctuary of his image over the uncertainty of a life with an equal. As the new Mr. and Mrs. Presley settled into their life at Graceland, the cracks in the foundation were already visible to anyone paying attention. Elvis may have secured the ideal wife to wait for him at home, but his spirit remained restless, wandering back to the high-energy days in Nevada. He had performed his duty, but the cost was a piece of his soul that he would never truly recover. The connection between Elvis and Ann-Margret was dormant, but it wasn't dead. It was simply waiting for the day they would meet again as survivors of a love that the world wouldn't let them have. The spotlight eventually moved on from the wedding of the century, but the echoes of that guitar-shaped arrangement lingered. While Elvis attempted to play the part of the devoted husband, the void left by Ann-Margret's absence began to grow. He was about to learn that you can marry for tradition, but you cannot force the heart to forget the woman who once set it on fire. The next chapter of their lives would see them drifting apart, only to find their way back to each other in a way that no one, not even the Colonel, could have predicted. In the years following the marriage of the century, Elvis and Ann-Margret lived out two very different versions of the American dream. For Elvis, life at Graceland became a gilded prison of his own making. He had achieved the old-fashioned family life he thought he wanted, but the reality was far from the domestic bliss he had envisioned. Priscilla was young, often lonely, and increasingly frustrated by the rigid rules Elvis imposed on her. He wanted a wife who stayed home, but he was rarely there himself, lost in a haze of grueling film schedules and a growing dependence on prescription medication. The sanctuary he sought had become a source of profound tension, proving that you cannot force a person into a mold without eventually breaking their spirit. While Elvis struggled with the constraints of his marriage, Ann-Margret was undergoing a transformation of her own. She didn't fade into the background as a scorned woman. Instead, she became a powerhouse of the entertainment industry. In 1967, she married Roger Smith, a man who became her manager and protector. Unlike Elvis, who felt threatened by her brilliance, Roger championed it. He encouraged her career, stood by her through a devastating, near-fatal stage fall, and provided the professional stability Elvis never could. The irony was palpable. The very independence that Elvis feared was exactly what allowed Ann-Margret to build a stable, lifelong partnership. Despite the physical and marital distance between them, the connection between the king and his Lady Elvis never truly severed. Members of the Memphis Mafia, the inner circle who saw everything, observed that Elvis never spoke of Ann-Margret with anything but the deepest respect and a lingering sense of melancholy. She was the one who got away, the mirror soul who existed in a world he was no longer allowed to inhabit. He watched her success from afar, perhaps realizing that his choice of a traditional life had cost him a partner who could have actually survived the storm of his fame alongside him. As the 1960s drew to a close, Elvis's film career was stagnating, and he felt the urgent need to reclaim his throne as a live performer. He was preparing for a massive comeback in Las Vegas, the very city where his romance with Ann-Margret had first ignited. The stage was set for a reunion that would redefine their relationship for the rest of their lives. He was about to step back into the spotlight, and he knew there was only one person whose presence in the audience truly mattered. On July 31, 1969, Elvis Presley made his triumphant return to the stage at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. It was a career-defining moment, a high-octane performance that proved the king was far from finished. And there, sitting in a place of honor, was Ann-Margret. Their reunion wasn't a scandalous affair or a rekindling of a lost romance. It was something far more profound. It was the birth of a deep, platonic friendship built on mutual survival and a shared history that no one else could touch. They had moved past the heartbreak and the silence, finding a middle ground where they could support one another without the pressure of the public eye. Throughout the 1970s, as Elvis's health began its slow, tragic decline, Ann-Margret remained a constant, quiet presence in his life. They attended each other's shows religiously. Every time Ann-Margret opened a new residency in Vegas, a guitar-shaped flower arrangement would appear in her dressing room, a tradition Elvis maintained until his final days. It was a secret language between them, a recurring reminder of the Viva Las Vegas days, and the love that had survived its own ending. While his marriage to Priscilla eventually dissolved in 1973, his bond with Ann-Margret only grew more resilient, anchored in a respect that transcended the chaos of Hollywood. Ann-Margret became one of the few people who truly knew the man behind the myth, the lonely, spiritual, and often misunderstood human being hidden under the jumpsuits. She was fiercely protective of him. Even decades later, her voice would sharpen with defense if anyone dared to ridicule Elvis's artistry or his later years. She saw the genius where others saw a caricature. She understood that his excesses were often a shield for a sensitive soul that felt too much and was given too little genuine understanding by the world around him. Their close friendship lasted until the very end, a testament to the fact that soulmates don't always end up together in the traditional sense. Sometimes they exist as each other's witnesses, the only ones who can truly see the light before it goes out. But as the summer of 1977 approached, the light in Memphis was flickering dangerously low. The world was about to lose its king, and Ann-Margret was about to face a journey to Memphis that she never wanted to make. A final trip to say goodbye to the man who had changed her life forever. On August 16, 1977, the music died at Graceland. The world stood still as news broke that Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, had passed away at the age of 42. While thousands of fans gathered at the gates to weep for their idol, a small, somber group of celebrities made the pilgrimage to Memphis to pay their final respects. Among them, cloaked in grief and dignity, was Ann-Margret. She was one of the very few Hollywood peers to attend the funeral, a gesture that spoke volumes about a bond that had survived long after the cameras stopped rolling and the romance had been forced into the shadows. Ann-Margret never indulged in these public speculations or used her connection to Elvis to boost her own fame. Instead, she became the guardian of his dignity. In the decades following his death, whenever the media attempted to caricature Elvis as a tragic figure or a joke, Ann-Margret stood as his fiercest defender. She spoke of his kindness, his immense talent, and the man behind the myth that very few were allowed to see. She carried the secret of their love with a grace that is rare in the spotlight, proving that some connections are too sacred for the tabloid press. As she left Memphis that day, she took a piece of that storming love with her, leaving behind the guitar-shaped wreaths and the broken promises. She returned to her life and her long, successful marriage, but the memory of the king remained etched in her spirit. The man who couldn't commit to one woman had somehow managed to stay committed to a friendship that outlasted his own life. It was a bittersweet ending to a story that began with a spark and ended in a worldwide mourning, leaving behind a legacy of what happens when duty wins over the heart. But even as the curtain closed on Elvis's life, the echoes of their time together refused to fade. The world would continue to dissect their romance, searching for the moment it all went wrong, while the survivors were left to piece together the fragments of a legendary life. Today, the story of Elvis and Ann-Margret remains one of Hollywood's greatest lost romances. Ann-Margret, now a legendary icon in her own right, remains a symbol of grace and endurance. Her marriage to Roger Smith lasted 50 years, until his passing in 2017, providing the very stability and partnership that Elvis had once feared. She continues to speak of Elvis with a warmth that has never cooled, reminding us that the storming love they shared wasn't just a brief flicker, but a transformative fire. In her eyes, he isn't the tragic figure found in the history books. He is the man who sent her flowers every time she stepped onto a stage, long after the world thought they had said goodbye. The tragedy of Elvis Presley wasn't just how he died, but how he chose to live, caught between the expectations of his past and the possibilities of a future he was too afraid to claim. His story serves as a profound reminder that the safe choice isn't always the right one, and that sometimes the storm is exactly what we need to stay alive. Elvis chose the sanctuary of tradition, but in doing so, he lost the one person who truly spoke his language. If you found this deep dive into the hidden history of the king and his lady Elvis compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more untold stories from the golden age of icons. We want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Elvis would have lived a longer, happier life if he had chosen Ann-Margret over the expectations of his family and the Colonel? Your insights help us keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of history. Next chapter of history. Next chapter of history. Next chapter of history.